What happens when one of the most influential global superstars in the world walks onto one of daytime television's most outspoken talk shows expecting a thoughtful conversation, but instead finds herself face-to-face with a question that shifts the tone of the entire room in seconds? Make sure to subscribe to Talk Show Fallout and like and comment for more talk show coverage. The audience is already applauding as the segment begins, that familiar energy filling the studio. The hosts are seated around the table, smiling, shuffling their cards, exchanging quick glances as the introduction wraps up. There's a buzz in the air, not unusual for a guest of this level, but there's definitely an edge to it today. One of the hosts leans forward slightly, smiling toward the camera. "We are so excited for our next guest," she says, her tone upbeat but measured. "She's an icon, a performer, a businesswoman, and she's here with us today." More applause. Louder this time. As Beyoncé walks out, the audience immediately rises to their feet. It's not just applause, it's a full standing ovation. Some people are cheering, some are clapping above their heads. The energy spikes instantly. She smiles, composed, gracious, acknowledging the crowd as she makes her way to the table. "Thank you," she says softly as she takes her seat, nodding toward the audience. "Thank you so much." One of the hosts reaches out, lightly touching her arm. "We're so happy you're here." "Thank you for having me," Beyoncé replies, calm and warm. There's a brief pause as the applause fades. The mood feels positive, respectful, even celebratory. Another host jumps in. "You've been incredibly busy. New projects, performances, everything you touch seems to resonate. How do you balance all of that?" Beyoncé smiles slightly, folding her hands on the table. "I try to stay grounded. I focus on what matters most to me, my family, my work, and making sure that what I put out into the world has meaning." The conversation flows easily at first. They talk about her recent work, her creative process, her influence. The hosts nod along, occasionally interjecting with light comments. The audience listens closely, reacting with soft laughter and applause at the right moments. Then the shift begins. One of the hosts, Joy Behar, leans forward, adjusting her glasses slightly. Her tone is still conversational, but there's a noticeable change in the way she approaches her next question. "You've always been very intentional with your image and your messaging," Joy says. "But some critics say that lately, your work has become more political, more pointed. Do you think that risks alienating part of your audience?" There's a subtle reaction in the room. Not loud, but noticeable. A few murmurs. A slight shift in posture from the other hosts. Beyoncé doesn't answer immediately. She takes a breath, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "I think," she begins slowly, "that being honest in your work isn't about trying to please everyone." Joy nods, but leans in again. "But do you worry that by taking certain positions, you might be dividing your fans?" Another host quickly interjects, her tone lighter. "Or maybe challenging them?" A bit of laughter from the audience, easing the tension for a moment. Beyoncé glances briefly toward the host who spoke, then back at Joy. "I think art has always been a reflection of what's happening around us," she says. "For me, it's not about division. It's about truth. It's about telling stories that are real." The audience claps softly. Not explosive, but supportive. Joy doesn't back off. "But when you have a platform as big as yours, don't you think there's a responsibility to stay neutral? To bring people together rather than..." Before she can finish, another host cuts in gently. "I think she is bringing people together, just maybe in a different way." There's a ripple of agreement from parts of the audience. Joy raises her hand slightly, not confrontational but firm. "I'm just asking the question. A lot of viewers wonder about this." Beyoncé nods. She doesn't seem rattled, but there's a quiet intensity now. "I understand the question," she says. "But I don't believe neutrality is always the answer. Sometimes being silent is what creates distance between people." That lands. The audience reacts more strongly this time, a mix of applause and a few audible responses. One of the other hosts leans back slightly, watching the exchange carefully. Another shifts in her seat, clearly aware that the tone of the segment has changed. Joy tilts her head. "So you don't see it as political?" "I see it as human," Beyoncé replies, her voice steady. "When I speak about things that matter to me, it's not about politics. It's about lived experiences. It's about reality." There's a pause. The room feels quieter now, more focused. Joy glances down at her notes briefly, then back up. "But some people feel..." Before she can continue, Beyoncé gently but firmly speaks again. "Not everyone is going to feel the same way," she says. And that's okay. But I think it's important to create space for conversations that might be uncomfortable. That's how people grow. The audience responds with stronger applause now. A few people nodding visibly in their seats. One of the hosts smiles, trying to balance the moment. That's a powerful way to look at it. Another adds, and it's clearly resonating with a lot of people. Joy leans back slightly, crossing her arms loosely. She doesn't look upset, but she's clearly still engaged. I just think, she says, that when you're in that position, everything you say carries weight. Beyoncé nods again. I agree with that, she says. And that's exactly why I choose my words carefully. There's a brief silence, not awkward but charged. The audience is completely locked in now. One of the hosts tries to lighten the mood again. Well, you've definitely given people a lot to think about. A small laugh ripples through the audience, but it doesn't fully break the tension. Beyoncé smiles politely, but her expression remains focused. Conversations like this are important, she adds. Even when they're not easy. The camera lingers on the table. The hosts, the subtle shifts in posture, the audience watching closely. And it's clear now, what started as a routine interview has turned into something much more real. There's a brief pause after that last line, the kind that doesn't usually happen in a daytime talk show unless something real is unfolding. The audience isn't laughing or clapping right away. They're listening, watching, trying to read the room. One of the hosts exhales softly and smiles, trying to keep the flow moving. And that's why we're glad you're here, she says, glancing between Beyoncé and the rest of the table. Because these are the conversations people are having at home too. A few audience members nod, and there's a light round of applause. Joy Behar leans forward again, resting her hands on the table. Her tone shifts slightly, less probing but still direct. Let me ask you this, she says. Do you ever feel misunderstood? Because when you put something out there and people interpret it differently than you intended, that can create tension. Beyoncé takes a second before answering. She looks down briefly, then back up, composed. I think being misunderstood is part of being human, she says. Especially when your work reaches as many people as mine does. Everyone brings their own experiences into what they see and hear. Joy nods. So you accept that? I've learned to, Beyoncé replies. But that doesn't mean I stop being intentional. It just means I understand that I can't control every interpretation. Another host jumps in, her tone more supportive. That's a level of awareness a lot of people don't have, honestly. Or patience, another adds, drawing a small laugh from the audience. Beyoncé smiles slightly. It takes time, but Joy isn't done yet. She shifts in her chair, turning slightly toward Beyoncé again. But when people criticize you, and they do, does it ever make you want to pull back? Maybe keep things lighter, less heavy. There's that word again. Heavy. The audience reacts subtly, a few murmurs, some shifting in seats. Beyoncé's expression changes just a little. Not defensive, but more focused. I don't see honesty as heavy, she says. I think sometimes people label things that way because they're not used to talking about them openly. That draws a stronger reaction. A few claps, a couple of that's right comments from the audience. Joy raises her eyebrows slightly. But entertainment is also supposed to be an escape, right? People turn to music to feel good, to get away from everything else. Before Beyoncé can respond, one of the other hosts interjects quickly. It can be both, though. Exactly, Beyoncé says, picking up smoothly. It doesn't have to be one or the other. You can celebrate, you can feel joy, and you can still acknowledge reality. The audience applauds again, louder this time. Joy tilts her head, considering that. So you're saying there's no line between the two? I'm saying the line is different for everyone, Beyoncé replies calmly. For me, my work reflects all parts of life. Not just the easy ones. There's a noticeable shift at the table. One of the hosts leans back, folding her hands, clearly taking in the exchange. Another nods slowly, watching Beyoncé with a thoughtful expression. Joy taps her fingers lightly on the table. But do you think your audience always wants that? She presses. Or are you asking them to meet you where you are, even if it's not where they are? That question hangs in the air. Beyoncé doesn't rush to answer. She looks toward the audience briefly, then back at Joy. I think I'm inviting them, she says. Not forcing them. The audience responds with a soft but steady round of applause. And the people who don't want that? Joy asks. They have a choice, Beyoncé says simply. There's a ripple through the audience, some nodding, some exchanging glances. One of the hosts smiles, trying to ease the tension again. That's the beauty of art, right? It's subjective. Exactly, Beyoncé says. But Joy leans in again, her voice quieter now but more pointed. I just wonder if there's ever a moment where you think, maybe I should dial it back. Not for yourself, but for the people who feel left out of the conversation. There's a noticeable reaction this time. A few audience members murmur louder, and one person audibly says, "Why should she?" Another host immediately raises her hand slightly, addressing the audience with a quick smile. Let's let her answer. Beyoncé remains calm, but there's a firmness in her posture now. I don't believe in shrinking to make others comfortable, she says. The audience breaks into applause, louder, more unified. Joy leans back slightly, exhaling through her nose, not dismissive but clearly taking in the response. But I do believe, Beyoncé continues, her tone still steady, in creating space where people can grow into understanding. That's different. The applause continues for a moment before settling. One of the hosts nods emphatically. That's an important distinction. Another adds, very important. Joy looks at her, then back at Beyoncé. So you see yourself as guiding that conversation? Beyoncé shakes her head gently. No, I see myself as participating in it. That answer lands differently, quieter, but just as impactful. The audience reacts with a softer, more thoughtful applause. There's a brief pause at the table again. The energy has shifted even further now, less like an interview, more like a real discussion unfolding in real time. One of the hosts leans forward, trying to redirect slightly. Let's talk about your creative process for a second, she says, smiling. Because clearly, there's a lot of thought behind what you do. Beyoncé nods, but before she can fully pivot, Joy speaks again. Just one more thing on this, she says, raising a finger slightly. A few audience members groan softly, not loudly, but enough to be heard. Joy glances toward them with a half smile. I know, she says. But it's important. She turns back to Beyoncé. Do you think celebrities have a responsibility to speak on these issues? Or is it a choice? That question shifts the tone again. Beyoncé inhales slowly, considering her words carefully. I think everyone has a responsibility to be aware, she says. But how they choose to express that awareness, that's personal. Joy nods. So it's not an obligation? It's a decision, Beyoncé replies. The audience reacts again, a mix of applause and thoughtful silence. One of the hosts leans in. And you've clearly made your decision. Beyoncé smiles slightly. Yes. There's a pause, and for a moment, it feels like the conversation might finally move on. But the tension hasn't fully left the table. The camera catches a quick exchange of glances between the hosts, subtle but telling. They all know something just happened. This isn't just a promotional interview anymore. It's a moment. The pause that follows isn't uncomfortable, but it's heavier than anything earlier in the segment. The kind of silence where everyone knows they're in the middle of something that's no longer routine television. One of the hosts lets out a small breath and smiles toward Beyoncé. I think what people are seeing right now, she says, is exactly why your voice matters. You're very clear about where you stand. A few audience members clap, softer this time, more thoughtful than excited. Beyoncé nods slightly. I try to be. Joy Behar shifts again in her seat, her posture less forward now, but she's still clearly engaged. She glances briefly at the other hosts before speaking. I will say this, she begins, you're very composed. Because not everyone would sit here and handle these questions the way you are. There's a mix of reactions, a few laughs, a couple of sounds. Beyoncé gives a small smile. I appreciate that. But, Joy continues, holding up a finger slightly, some people might say that being composed can also come across as distant. Like you're not fully letting people in. There's an immediate reaction from the audience, louder this time. A few surprised murmurs, even a scattered, "Oh," from somewhere in the middle rows. One of the hosts quickly turns toward Joy. I don't know if that's fair, she says, her tone still calm but firmer than before. Joy looks back at her. I'm saying what people say. And she's answering you, the host replies, gesturing toward Beyoncé. The audience claps briefly at that. Beyoncé remains still for a moment, then leans forward just slightly. The first real physical shift she's made since the conversation started. I think there's a difference between privacy and distance, she says. The room quiets again almost instantly. I've always been intentional about what I share, she continues. Not because I don't want people to connect with me, but because I believe connection doesn't require full access. That line lands. The audience responds with a stronger, more unified applause. a few people even standing briefly before sitting back down. Joy watches her closely. But don't you think people feel closer to you when you're more open? I think people feel closer when something resonates with them, Beyoncé replies. That doesn't always come from sharing everything. Sometimes it comes from sharing the right things. Another ripple of applause. One of the hosts nods, clearly agreeing. That's true. Oversharing doesn't always create connection. Exactly, Beyoncé says. Joy leans back, crossing her arms loosely again, but she's not disengaging. If anything, she seems more focused. I guess what I'm getting at, she says, is that when you're as influential as you are, people look to you not just for art, but for guidance. Whether you want that role or not. Beyoncé listens carefully, then nods once. I understand that, she says. But I don't see myself as someone people should follow. I see myself as someone who reflects. That answer gets a quieter reaction. Less applause, more contemplation. You can feel the audience thinking about it. One of the hosts leans in, intrigued. Reflects what? Life, Beyoncé says simply. Experiences. Emotions. Truths that people might not always have the words for. There's a pause, and then a wave of applause builds again, steady, respectful. Joy glances at the audience, then back at Beyoncé. You're very good at answering these questions, she says, almost half smiling now. A few laughs break out. Beyoncé smiles back, but there's a seriousness behind it. I've had time to think about them. That line gets a bigger reaction, laughter mixed with applause. One of the hosts jumps in, sensing a moment to shift the tone slightly. Let's talk about how much preparation actually goes into what you do, she says. Because people see the final product, but they don't always see the work behind it. Beyoncé nods. There's a lot that goes into it, she says. From the concept to the execution, every detail matters. Do you ever feel pressure to keep raising the bar? Another host asks. Of course, Beyoncé replies. But it's not pressure from outside. It's from myself. The conversation starts to open up again, but the intensity doesn't fully disappear. It lingers underneath. Joy watches for a moment, then leans in again, slower this time, more deliberate. I want to go back to something you said earlier, she says. There's an audible reaction from the audience, a few groans, a couple of laughs. Joy smiles slightly. I know, she says again. But this is interesting. She turns back to Beyoncé. You said you don't believe in shrinking to make others comfortable. Beyoncé nods. Joy continues. But is there ever a point where standing firm can come across as unwilling to listen? That question lands harder than the others. The table goes quiet. Even the other hosts don't jump in right away. Beyoncé doesn't answer immediately. She looks at Joy, then briefly at the other hosts, then back at Joy. I think listening and changing are two different things, she says. The audience murmurs, not loud but engaged. I listen all the time, she continues. I hear different perspectives, different opinions. But listening doesn't mean I abandon what I believe. Applause builds again, stronger now. Joy nods slowly. So you're open but not flexible? Beyoncé tilts her head slightly. I'm open to growth, she says. But growth doesn't always mean moving away from your foundation. Sometimes it means standing on it more firmly. That line hits. The audience reacts immediately. Loud applause, a few people clapping above their heads again. One of the hosts leans back, smiling. That's a line right there. Another adds, people at home are writing that down. Laughter breaks the tension for a moment, but it doesn't erase what just happened. Joy exhales, nodding again. All right, she says. I hear you. It's not a concession, but it's the closest thing to one so far. There's a brief pause, and then one of the hosts steps in, clearly trying to reset the energy. Let's take a quick moment, she says with a light smile. Because when we come back, we're going to talk more about your upcoming projects and what's next for you. The audience applauds, grateful for the shift. But as the camera begins to pull back slightly, the tension is still there. Not explosive, not hostile, but real. And everyone in the room knows it. This wasn't just another segment. It became something else entirely. As the show returns from the break, the energy in the room feels different. Not tense in a sharp way, but heavier, like everyone, from the host to the audience, is still processing what just happened. The applause starts again, but it's slightly more measured this time. Beyoncé is already seated, composed as ever, hands resting calmly on the table. The hosts settle back into position, exchanging quick glances that don't go unnoticed. One of them smiles toward the camera. Welcome back, she says. We're here with Beyoncé, and I think it's safe to say this has been a conversation people are going to be talking about. A ripple of laughter moves through the audience, mixed with applause. Joy Behar nods slightly, her tone noticeably softer now. That's true, she says. And I'll say this, I appreciate you staying in it. Not everyone would. Beyoncé turns toward her, offering a small, respectful nod. I think it's important, she says. Even when we don't agree on everything. There's a light round of applause, not loud but genuine. Another host leans in, clearly trying to guide things toward a more reflective tone. I think what people saw today, she says, was a real exchange. Not just questions and answers, but an actual conversation. Exactly, another host adds. And those don't always happen on live TV. The audience chuckles softly. Joy looks at Beyoncé again. Do you think conversations like this actually change anything? She asks. It's not confrontational this time. It feels more curious. Beyoncé takes a moment before answering. I think they can, she says. Not always immediately. But they plant something. They make people think, question, reflect. A few audience members nod, and there's a quiet murmur of agreement. And sometimes, she continues, that's where change starts. The audience applauds again, steady, thoughtful. One of the hosts smiles. That's a hopeful way to look at it. I think you have to be hopeful, Beyoncé replies. There's a brief pause, and for the first time since the tension began, the atmosphere feels more balanced. Not resolved, exactly, but settled. Another host glances toward the audience. I'm curious, she says. How many of you feel like you've been part of something a little different today? A number of hands go up. Some people clap. A few laugh. Joy smiles faintly, shaking her head just a little. I think we all have. Beyoncé lets out a small breath, almost like a release, but her composure never breaks. The conversation shifts slightly after that. Lighter topics, upcoming work, future plans. But even as they talk about projects and creative ideas, there's still an undercurrent from earlier. It shows in the way the hosts listen more carefully now, in the way they don't interrupt as quickly, in the way the audience reacts with more attention. As the segment begins to wrap, one of the hosts turns toward Beyoncé with a warm smile. Before we let you go, she says, what's one thing you want people to take away from everything you do? Beyoncé pauses, thinking carefully. That it's okay to be honest, she says. With yourself, with others. Even when it's uncomfortable. The audience responds immediately, applause building, louder than before. And that growth doesn't come from avoiding those moments, she adds. It comes from facing them. The applause continues, stronger now, with a few people standing again. Joy looks out at the audience, then back at Beyoncé. She nods once, a small but noticeable gesture. Fair enough, she says. It's simple, but it carries weight. One of the hosts smiles brightly, sensing the right moment to close. Thank you so much for being here, she says. Thank you, Beyoncé replies. The audience rises into a full standing ovation this time, louder than when she first walked out. Not just excitement, but respect. The kind that builds after people feel like they've witnessed something genuine. As Beyoncé stands and waves, the camera pans across the audience. People clapping, some still talking to each other, clearly energized by what they just saw. The show fades out, but the conversation doesn't end there. Almost immediately after the broadcast, clips begin circulating online. Short moments from the exchange, especially the more intense parts, start gaining traction. Viewers replay the questions, the responses, the pauses. On platforms like Twitter and Instagram, reactions pour in. Some people praise Beyoncé for staying calm and standing firm. Others debate the questions, the tone, the direction of the conversation. Hashtags begin trending. Short clips rack up thousands, then millions of views. One post reads, "That's how you handle pressure on live TV." Another says, "This is the kind of conversation we need more of." Of course, not everyone agrees. Some viewers side with Joy, arguing that the questions were valid and necessary. Others feel the tension shouldn't have gone as far as it did. But that's the thing, people are talking. Media outlets pick it up quickly, analyzing the exchange, breaking down key moments. Commentators replay specific lines, discussing what they meant, how they landed, why they resonated. Backstage, sources later say the mood was surprisingly calm. No raised voices, no lingering conflict. Just a recognition that something real had happened on air. One of the producers reportedly mentioned that it was one of the most engaging segments they've had in a long time. And for the hosts, the moment lingers too. In the following days, they briefly revisit the conversation, reflecting on what it meant and how it was received. As for Beyoncé, she doesn't immediately respond online. No direct statements, no follow-up posts. Just silence, the same intentional kind she spoke about earlier. And somehow, that silence says just as much. The clip continues to circulate, continuing to spark discussion well beyond the show itself. Because what people witnessed wasn't just a celebrity interview. It was a real conversation, with tension, disagreement, respect, and honesty all happening at once. And those are the moments that stick. So what do you think? Did Beyoncé handle the situation the right way? Or do you think the questions pushed the conversation where it needed to go? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Talk Show Fallout for more real talk show stories.